Good morning or good afternoon even, and welcome to the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion webinar series focusing on the gender pay gap today. Thank you for joining our webinar. We will begin in the next couple of minutes. Just a quick reminder, you're all on mute, but if you do have any questions now or during the webinar, you can use the chat or Q&A functions on your dashboard. We have three speakers today. So to see the video for all three at the same time, hover your mouse over the screen and a layout button should appear in the top right-hand corner. If you click on the grid option there, it should give you our three speakers. So thank you for joining. And Maureen, if you are there, we can get started.
Indeed I am. Thank you.
There you go. Lovely.
Very good. Hope you can hear me and see me. So welcome. So while society has no doubt made strides in the right direction when it comes to equality and inclusion, what I'm about to share with you is a reminder of where we are and the work we still need to do. So nowhere in the world are women being paid the same as men. In Ireland, our gender pay gap is 14%, which is the difference of the average hourly wage between a man and a woman. If we continue to make the same rate of progress to close this gender pay gap, it will take 100 years, 2121, before parity is achieved. Now, that's not in our daughters' working lives, nor is it in our granddaughters' working lives. It's more than likely our great-granddaughters who will see parity. So, welcome to the Hayes Equality, Diversity and Inclusion webinar series in partnership with the Centre of Excellence at ED&I at DCU. Once a quarter, we host a webinar that explores a theme linked to ED&I. We highlight the issue, investigate its causes, show the positive impact of change, and hopefully give you practical solutions you can implement to drive that change. Today, as you know, we're focusing on the gender pay gap and the corresponding legislation that is coming our way in Ireland. And to help us to do that, I'm delighted to be joined by Sandra Healy, who's the founding director of the Centre of Excellence, ED&I at DCU, and to Dr. Kara McGann, head of policy at IBEC, who is also a key contributor to the government on this legislation. So welcome to you both. I think you're joining us there. Hi.
Good afternoon, Maureen. Hi.
Good afternoon.
Hi there, how are you?
Great, yeah, very good. Excellent, so thank you for joining us. To kick off, we actually got a lot of questions in prior to this webinar, which was excellent. And a lot of them were around the practicalities of the legislation and how it's going to impact them from the point of view of reporting or what it's involved and who it is. So Cara, I might go to you first regarding the legislation itself, how it's come about, where it's at, and potentially what's the opportunity here.
Certainly, Maureen. So I suppose this has been a long time coming and we're still not there yet. So it's about 5 years we've been working on this with the government, and progress has been made, but we're still waiting for it to come back to the houses of the Oireachtas. So it was progressing, things got in the way, like a restructure within the department, the repeal of the 8th Amendment and so on, and then the government fell. So we're now progressing again, but it is very much high on the list of Minister Roderick O'Gorman with a view to getting it passed as soon as possible. So in the coming weeks, we expect to see it back before the houses. So as the bill stands at the moment, what it is proposing is that we will be requiring employers, initially employers of 250 plus employees, to report on their mean and median pay differences between men and women, the mean and median bonus differences between men and women, the percentage of men and women receiving a bonus. That includes both full-time and part-time workers, and unusually, and something that isn't in any other jurisdiction, also a calculation of benefit in kind and the difference between men and women. So a fair bit there. If everything went to plan and we pass through the houses of the Oireachtas in the coming weeks, and it certainly hasn't received any challenge so far, everybody is quite supportive of this piece of legislation, we would expect to see then work to progress to the regulations. Now, this is actually the real meat of the issue, the actual how do we calculate ordinary pay? What do we include and exclude? What do we actually calculate when we're talking about bonus pay? And we've learned a lot, I think, from the UK experience as to what might work well, but equally what we don't want to see to transfer over to the Irish experience. So that piece of work has to be done, and really that's a bit of a stumbling block for employers in terms of what exactly are we trying to calculate here. So it is a meaty piece of work that does need to be done. If everything went to plan, I think the earliest we could expect for companies of 250 plus employees to have to report would be, for the first time, would be towards the end of 2022, which doesn't sound like it's around the corner, but to be honest, we have a lot of prep work that needs to be done in advance. So it's good that we have kind of a bit of a lead in time like that. It would then progress to companies of 150 plus employees, and then further to companies of 50 plus employees, with the probable expectation that there'd be a year's gap between each of those being introduced.
Okay, yeah, it's very interesting. And just on that, you mentioned the UK legislation and the government looking to that. They are considering maybe what has worked well or hasn't worked well in framing this legislation.
That's right. So one area, for example, that they are considering bringing in here is the idea of quartiles. So along with the mean and median pay and bonus pay arrangements, the UK also looked at quartiles, which is basically dividing your workforce into equal quarters, and you're reporting on kind of the level of pay gap at each of those quarters. To some degree, it's somewhat meaningless. You know, you can be pretty sure that those at the top are going to have, you know, a bigger gap than those at the bottom, because gender pay, after all, the gender pay gap, what it's measuring is really not about pay so much as about representation. So if you've got more men at the top of your organization in senior roles and more women at the bottom of your organization in junior or even more in part-time roles, you're likely to see a bigger gender pay gap. So what we've learned from the UK, I suppose, are some of the anomalies that that went into their calculations. So for example, there was an arrangement whereby if you, for tax purposes, wanted to do a salary sacrifice as an employee for ABCs for your pension, or as they had it at the time for childcare vouchers, which, as you can imagine, a lot of women in particular were going for. Yeah. The employer didn't have the possibility of including that salary sacrificed piece in the calculations, which makes no sense given that it is being paid to the employee. It's an actual employee decision as to what they're doing with it. It's just for tax purposes. And this makes no sense because immediately you're going to have a skewed arrangement. Similarly, you were including shift work but not overtime, and again, that can be quite gendered. And so all of these issues were anomalies that we feel shouldn't be carried across to the Irish experience. There's plenty of areas that absolutely would be fine and no problem, but we won't actually be comparing exactly the same gender pay gap figure, and that's the same across Europe because everybody has their own specifics around the regulations.
Okay, all right, okay, it's very interesting. But it's great to hear we're learning, we're trying to learn and bring the best fit to the legislation. Excellent. Then just again, a little bit around the reporting, you outlined 250 and then 150 in the timeline. We got a number of questions in where potentially organizations have 30 employees here in Ireland where they're part of a bigger global organization which would supersede the 150 or the 250 in various different countries. So is it only the entity in Ireland, or if you're part, if you're an Irish entity but have tentacles everywhere else,
sure,
are you included?
So basically the way it will work is that there will be no reporting for companies under 50 at this point in time. So if you only have, say, around 30 in Ireland, that won't be a requirement for you. Now, interestingly, you talk about groups, and so the expectation is, say, for example, you have 4 entities that are part of your group in Ireland, and they're 4 different entities. If 2 of them have 250 plus employees and the other 2 have maybe only 50 or less, only the 2 with the 250 plus employees will be expected to report, not whether the group as an entirety has or not. Now, that's as it stands in the conversations that we're having at the moment. What we have seen, though, is that some companies don't like to just report, if you like, because maybe as a group, the actual picture is better. Maybe that certain entities, for legal reasons and maybe IP reasons or whatever, they're set up in a particular way, and they just happen to be more female dominated or male dominated, but as a group they're actually quite gender balanced. Then they might like to also report the group figure because it actually tells more of the picture, because it is important about context. This figure on its own is meaningless. You know what I mean? It doesn't indicate discrimination. It doesn't indicate bias. We can't make any of those conclusions. All it tells us is there is a representational difference between the men and women in your organization. So absolutely, you'd have to, as it stands at the moment, you would have to report each distinct entity that has the correct number of employees. Whether or not you then choose to also publish a global figure or a group figure for the entities in Ireland, that would be your choice at this point.
Yeah, very interesting. And I was actually speaking to our global head of reward, who's been, who would published these numbers in the UK for the last 3 years. Well, not last year, they didn't have, but they did do the exercise. But again, yeah, this reporting piece, she spoke a lot about it, and I might touch about it on that later. And she highlighted the point about, okay, we'll be focused on the external reporting, but don't forget the internal reporting as well. There's a story there to be told, communicating to your internal employees. Just to go back then to the timing, because you're saying, okay, potentially we'll be reporting at the end of 2022. There seems to be we've got lots of time. Have we got lots of time?
I don't believe we do, because there is quite a bit of preparation to be done in this area. And to be honest, it's a real opportunity to take that time and prepare. What we're seeing companies starting to do to prepare in this period of time, if you like, and I do accept it is difficult without an actual methodology to use, but making sure that your financial systems are talking to your HR systems, that you know how many part-time and full-time workers you have, in terms of what types of workers there are. Have you agency workers? What does your profile look like? Are your systems talking to each other in the way that you'll actually be able to pull down that information? Secondly, what does your narrative look like? Is this something that you've known, and maybe, let's say, take in the tech sector, we know we're not getting enough graduates in, female graduates, if you like, out in the tech subjects. And we know a lot of organizations are doing a huge amount of work with schools, with colleges, to really address that particular issue. That's really, really important, but that is part of your narrative. It shows what you're doing to actually address this gender balance issue. And similarly, as you absolutely said, it's as important, that narrative is as important for your internal customer as it is for your external customer, because at the end of the day, this is a figure, but actually what action you're going to take, how are you going to address this figure and shift it is really where the importance is. So then I think the third part of the preparation is really looking at your communication strategy. Who are you going to communicate to, and when, and how? What we found, and a learning we can take from the UK, is very much around some employees found out through press releases or through the media what their company's figure was, and that left a really bad taste. Others took the role of a dual release, if you like, with internal workshops and an open staff briefing along with a public publishing of the figure. So it's all of those pieces. I think we have an opportunity now, but the biggest part of that is probably around actually looking at what can we do and how quickly can we get our figures together to understand what our gap might be.
Can you hear us?
Sorry.
Just 5 seconds. Yeah, just for a second.
Apologies. But that we can understand what the gap is and what makes it up in our organisation and why it might be there, and then what action we might take.
Yeah, excellent. And I might bring you in, Sandra, on that, because I know you speak about that impact of the non-financial aspect of reporting, and the impact that can have overall in ED&I. And I suppose something that we see in our own research, that talent and job seekers very much are looking for the ED&I commitment, and that being very much expressed by organizations.
Yeah, and that's interesting, Maureen, because certainly what I've seen over the last 18 months or so is, there's a real importance and focus now on the non-financial aspect of the annual report, where in the past, I would say the focus has very much just been on the financials. I think what we're starting to see now is there's more of a focus and more consciousness around kind of ethical ethical ways of running your business. There's more of a focus on culture and diversity and inclusion, and in particular from shareholders, customers, stakeholders, and in particular employees, as you've mentioned there, Maureen. I know in your own research there published last year, I think it was 73% you showed of potential employees will actively research a company before they will even consider applying. And I saw similar figures in a piece of research published on International Women's Day actually last year by Accenture, and it was in around 80%. And what was interesting actually in that particular research report is they talked about the culture disconnect of how 68% of leaders think they create empowering, enriching environments where people can be themselves and innovate, and yet only 36% of people in the organization actually agree with that. So taking it back to a point that Kara is making is that this is about representation. You know, it does feel like there's a lot of time before you have to put a report in, but you have to take into consideration tenure and turnover. Okay, yeah. And it's not a lot of time to try and redress a representation issue. So the point that Kara made around being able to kind of the narrative and tell the story is the one thing, it's probably really the only thing you can do now, because if you're going to be publishing a not so great story for your employees and your customers and your shareholders, it's really, really important that you're able to tell the story of the activities that you've taken to date, but also what are you going to do? What are your commitments? You know, your short, medium and long-term action planning around how are you going to address it?
Yeah, and again, back to the timing, while it seems a long way away, it is a real opportunity for us, for businesses to really look at their organization and see where they're at potentially and how they could influence that story that they will tell in 2 years' time now. On that, are we aware, are there any organizations that are already volunteering, doing this, even though the legislation isn't there, or have already beginning to prepare, and what maybe they're doing?
Yeah, I think so, and I think there's some really good examples, I think, of that in Ireland, and actually I was talking to a couple of global organizations with UK based HQs based in the UK earlier this week, and two companies I was talking to specifically said that they're still going ahead because there's a delay on the publication of the gender pay gap reporting in the UK, but they've said just because they've got into the routine of doing it now and it's good, they see it as good practice and it's built into just the way they're doing things, that they're going ahead with that. I think certainly in my discussions with Kara in the past, I think because we were all looking at the UK saying, okay, how are things going to go there? And I think there were certainly mistakes made in year one, but I think what we've started to see now is beyond that, there's much more consistency and some really good practices and good transparency, I suppose, around what organizations are going to do to redress that representation issue. Yeah. I think in Ireland, I suppose one that stands out for me, and I'm sure they won't mind me calling them out, would be the An Post annual report. Like An Post didn't have any requirement to address or publish gender pay gap, but I was part of it was an evaluation board looking at annual reports, and I have to say theirs was absolutely fantastic and some really good insights into how they went about addressing it and how they tell that story. So for me, that certainly would be one that I would call out. Yeah.
Okay, excellent, very good. And Kara, are you aware of any organisations that are already maybe taking the lead on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose a number of organizations have already started to do it and maybe even communicated internally without going public with it. But others, say, for example, like PwC have reported theirs. And I think within the year, they saw a drop from 5.7% to 4.7% on their gender pay gap figure. And similarly, on their gender bonus gap figure, they improved by 3%, getting it to 8.8%. So apologies, I think
you're fine. Your
broadband's playing, but they also saw an improvement of 3% on their bonus figure, getting it down to 8.8% of a gender bonus gap. They were the first of the big four to volunteer to publish as a professional services firm, and really they've started to do things exactly to Sandra's point. They've started to look at the activities and really applying a gender lens to all their recruitment activities and beyond. So it's about, again, telling that story and how they're actually going to make a difference to that figure.
Yeah, it's back to what you can measure, you can impact, isn't it?
That's it.
Yeah. And then just so, Sandra, again, do you believe this legislation, of what you know about it, again, we don't have all the full details, do you think it will support the objective on narrowing the gap? And then I suppose, then to further, that, does that proposed legislation support the wider objective when it comes to ED&I?
Yeah, and it's a tough one, Maureen, because to some ways it's in some ways I suppose it gives us an indication of the size of the problem. Okay, and I think everybody accepts that what gets measured gets done, right? So we know that. I think what's going to be really challenging is if we look at the impact of COVID, because we can see that COVID has severely negatively impacted women more than men. I was actually reading a McKinsey report there earlier this week. Let me just catch the figures for you, which I thought was quite interesting. They talked about, now this is global figures, where they said women's jobs are 1.8 times more vulnerable to the crisis than men's. And they said that women make up 39% of global employment, but account for 54% of overall job losses.
Okay.
And that's really related to many things, precarious work, part-time, as Kara had mentioned, also related to unpaid care, and tough decisions having to be made in the household over who's going to, take on more caring responsibilities. And all of this, I'm on, as you know, I'm on the Citizens Assembly for Gender Equality now. I'm part of the expert advisory group. And I was in a conversation with somebody the other day, I was saying there couldn't be a better time for us to be having that conversation at a national level, because everybody is impacted by gender inequality now. And it is very apparent, no matter who you are or where you are. So in some respects, it's actually a good thing that it's happening, because it has brought up the inequalities and the vulnerability of women in particular in a crisis like this. Yeah. So, and I think that that's something that organizations need to take into consideration as well when it comes to the narrative. So, as is to consciously be paying attention to what's happening now, because this is not this isn't the norm of what of how they will be reporting in 5 years' time, for example. But just to finish off that point, so you asked, do I think it's working, right? I was actually reading Germany introduced gender pay gap reporting quite a few years ago, and they've actually just gone now to penalties and quotas, right? Because they've just gone, you know what, it's not working. It's too slow. There's lip service being paid to it. We have, there's a high proportion of companies that aren't even bothering submitting their reports. So they've just now moved, they've brought in, it's now in law, and there's unlimited financial penalties.
Wow.
So it's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah,
and just one small thing to add to that. I remember Christine Lagarde was being interviewed by our previous president, Professor Brian McCrath. She was being interviewed in the Helix, and he asked her the question around quotas. And she said, I regret that I didn't get behind quotas, she said earlier, because she said it's the only thing that's going to change in my estimation. And she'd actually quoted 200 years for parity. So I know you'd mentioned 100 at that time. She had said in their calculations 200 years for parity. So
yeah.
So it's a step in the right direction. Is it going to shift the dial as quickly as we need it to be? I don't know.
I think that's a really good point, Sandra, because I think it's one part of a whole of society approach that is needed. But back to your point, Maureen, what gets measured, gets the focus. I think it is a tool, but I think on its own, it's not enough, because we know that what is causing the gender pay gap are those structural things, many of which Sandra mentioned in terms of that area of care and unpaid work. And we know how it defaults more often to women than men, and that's both childcare and elder care. But similarly, around the structural issues of the cost of childcare, the fact that we don't have an elder care system that's serving exactly what we need. but also within our organizations, what impact the culture has. We hear, particularly in the STEM industries, that impact of, you know, even when we get women through the door, it's actually a retention issue then that we have to look at. So there's quite a number of structural issues, and Sandra's 100% right. They've only been exacerbated by the COVID crisis. I think they've been, you know, shone a light on it to even more so. We know that we're seeing more women in the roles and the industries that are being worst hit by COVID. So again, we're seeing those barriers coming through, and we're starting to see slippage. And while we didn't have the whole gender balance piece cracked, we absolutely cannot see, you know, an erosion of the progress that we had made over the past couple of decades. So gender pay gap reporting, absolutely, it will not solve the problem of gender balance, which it is ultimately about. But it is one part of a whole of society solution, but it will require so much more work on gender stereotypes. The work of the Citizens Assembly is going to address some really, really crucial issues in that whole area as well, which is great timing. But there's a lot of pieces to this puzzle. But I think Sandra's absolutely right. You know, if we use it as a part of the tools to understand what the problem is, it's very hard to fix the problem if you don't have a good sense of it, which is why getting that narrative and understanding where your gap is coming from is so important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would imagine a lot of people who are on this call today, there is a commitment around ED&I, and there is, you know, from female participation, and particularly you mentioned STEM, Kara, you know, I know that's a big focus in organizations of raising, you know, the number of females in all roles. We did a piece of research now, it's going back maybe 5 years ago, around women in IT, and because there's such a low, you know, number of females within IT, currently the culture piece that actually came across quite strongly on, yeah. So that was the big challenge to push with once they joined. Apologies, I'm getting a little bit of feedback. Are you guys, or I'll let you continue? Okay, so that's very, very interesting. Sandra, you mentioned there about COVID and the challenge, and I suppose I would just say, maybe, is this an opportunity now where organizations, there is being a flux and change, and that where organizations are rebuilding potentially, that now they could use this as an opportunity to rebuild the organization they would endeavor to want, or, you know, organizations are going through a lot of stress at the moment in crisis, and often that can be a challenge because you revert to the norm or what you knew. I don't know if you've any thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I have no surprises there. I was actually I was reading something yesterday, and I'm sure I'm not the only person who read about the Goldman Sachs boss David Solomon. Have you seen that report? Where he has rejected remote working as a new normal and labelled it an aberration.
Yeah, I could see that.
Okay, so that's tough, right? And it's interesting. I think it shows how emotive this topic is. And in some ways, you know, he's at the helm, and he's trying to keep things steady the ship. He's trying to keep things, you know, create a bit of certainty, I suppose, in the market around his organization. And so it's a tough one. I certainly do think there's an opportunity, Maureen, and quite recently I'd said there's an opportunity now for us to move away from the structures of the 1950s, and when you think about it, it's how our organizations are designed. Okay, so our organizations are designed of, you know, the Monday to Friday, the 9 to 5 if we're lucky, you know, where there's one breadwinner and the other person, usually the woman, stays at home and looks after the kids. You know, we have to shift our thinking away from that. And you know, I think people have shifted. I think society, and certainly, you know, millennials and the younger generations have absolutely shifted their thinking in that, and that's not acceptable in the type and how they want to conduct their lives and work. So I think that this is an opportunity now for employers to now embrace more flexibility, you know, be more sensitive, I suppose, to the competing demands of our lives as human beings. Mm-hmm. You know, so I think what's happened is we've seen the blend. There is a blending of our lives now. You know, with our dogs and our kids joining our Zoom calls. You know, so and it, you know, it brings an element of humanness to us, and I don't think anybody wants to move back from that. Yeah. So I would say, as employers, we need to think about And I'm certainly seeing that, Maureen. And it was interesting that you mentioned about different industries. We're doing a lot of work with aviation, who have been completely devastated, you think, as an industry during the crisis. But the conversations I'm seeing happening is they're seeing this as an opportunity to embrace more flexibility. And as they embrace more flexibility, they will attract a much more diverse candidates applying for jobs in that industry. So there is there's a real opportunity to embrace this and engage with your employees around what do they want to see as the organization of the future. And like the work will still be done. Okay, you'll have higher levels of commitment, higher levels of productivity, and the work will still be done. It's just that people that our lives are more blended now, I think, between home and work, and I just think we need to accept that as employers.
Yeah, and I might jump to you, Cara, on that as well, just with your IBEC hat on as business representative body. But we're, from that hybrid, working point of view, it's very clear in the research that's coming through from us is that, a high percentage of people want a flexible solution. And part of research, it came through on our survey that we recently published, 36% of people said they will change jobs if they cannot secure that flexibility. So that's a lot of people within an organization where, many organizations, that talent is really important to them. So yeah, I think we need to start thinking differently, or what's happened in the last year definitely has thrown us and has focused our minds. Cara, do you have any view there? We just, again, as I said, IBEC hat on potentially.
Yes, certainly. I think you're absolutely right. And I do think that hybrid way of the future, this is a real, if I can be so harsh as to say, the silver lining of COVID, which does seem a bit of a misnomer, but it is the opportunity now to rebuild and to rebuild in a different way. I think absolutely to Sandra's point, there are so many opportunities here to do things differently. And as you said, people will move if they don't get the type of flexibility and new arrangements. But I think we also have to be really, really mindful as to, if we have an organization, we even heard the narrative back in September after, people started to return in some degree back to the workplace. The real workers went back to the workplace and the others didn't. We cannot allow that narrative to slip in. And, we know from research over the years that oftentimes women can struggle to be visible and to put their hand up and say, look what I've achieved, or look what I've done. And men are better at being able to talk about what they've delivered and what they've achieved in a particular way. So if we're then taking people into remote working and working differently, are we at risk of losing even more of that visibility for women in particular? So we need to be training our managers as to how do we do this differently? How do we manage differently? How do we look for that differently? So that we don't, I suppose, shoot ourselves in the foot by getting this greater flexibility in remote working and ways of doing things differently, which can lift all of us, you know what I mean? And will be a benefit for all. And at the same time that we don't lose out on the innovation and the creativity and the decision making, but equally that visibility piece and actually see a greater disconnect, I suppose, between men and women in the workplace.
Yeah, and that's the danger. Sorry, go ahead. Sandra.
Sorry, Maureen, there's a delay there. Just to add to that, Maureen, and somebody has asked a question around what can we be doing. Like every single thing we're talking about here can be written into your action plan and your narrative around your gender pay gap reporting. So what I would say is if you have it front and center of all the activities you're doing now, you think about it as the activities that are moving, like every aspect, everything we talk about can be part of your action plan, whether it's short, medium, long term, having the conversation with your employees about the hybrid model around flexibility, if there's any changes in your policies, all of those kind of things are positive steps towards gender equity in your organization, and not just gender equity, in fairness, diversity in all its forms. Because when you create that culture, that inclusive culture, you naturally attract and attract a much more diverse workforce.
Yeah, and that is really important, isn't that true diversity? Because we've all heard it's the right thing to do, but it's absolutely proven now. It's the smart thing to do at all levels, and hence it's on every CEO's agenda. But there is the risk. Well, there's an opportunity with this legislation and with with around COVID, etc. There is a risk as well, isn't there? And I know, Sandra, previously you mentioned around the real workers went back to work, but also that you more thought around not being in the room. That was a challenge even prior to COVID that we should be conscious of.
Yeah, and I think that this is something that Kara and I have spoken about as well. And in our National Diversity and Inclusion Day event, we were talking about, and we were actually, that was June, right? So we were just kind of at the start, really, of people moving to like 100% kind of out of office working. And one of the points that came up there was around, who's in the room. So who's particularly for senior leaders and particularly for managers, who's not there when you're having the critical conversations, who's not there when decisions are being made, and that takes an extra conscious effort now, because it's not as easy as you meet somebody in the stairwell, or you catch up with somebody in the lift, or you have a coffee. Those conversations, water cooler moments as they call them, right, are not happening. So when it comes to decisions being made, who's in the room and who's not in the room. And to Kara's point about I think there needs to be, we can't just decide we're going for a hybrid model and everything just works. It doesn't, because we need to be more structured as people managers then around our one-to-ones, around our, development conversations, make sure that our sponsorship and our mentoring programs work within the new model. So it's not just simply let's bring in a new policy and this flexible working. We have to then apply that as the lens across all our structures and say, because we don't want to be losing talent. You don't want to make a decision that inadvertently now is going to have a negative impact on a group of people because you haven't considered them. So it's challenging. But what I would say is, if you're documenting your journey, again, that's going to go towards a positive report then around your gender pay gap activities.
Okay, very good. Now there is a question here, and I should have said it earlier. If you do have any questions, you can put it into the chat function on the right-hand side, the bottom right-hand side of your screen. So again, we did touch on this earlier, but there's a question around the timeline when to expect mandatory reporting to happen for companies below 250. So again, I think that's probably 2023, Kara, is it, from what you said earlier?
I would think at its earliest, Maureen, to be honest, they are likely to give about a 12-month, if not a little bit more, gap between the 250 plus before they go to the 150 plus, and then a further, again, we'd expect about a 12-month. Now they could make it 6 months, but we'll know sooner rather than later. And as I say, the earliest it's looking at for the 250 is the end of 2022.
Yeah. But I think what we said earlier was time is gold at the moment. We have it.
Big time.
Yeah, take advantage of it
it
and build your story, as you've quite, you both of you have said. So I suppose maybe to both of you then, I think, so the legislation's coming our way. Okay, we don't have all the details yet. What do you believe will be the biggest challenge in getting this implemented correctly for organisations? And even, I suppose, the technical correctly, but the spirit as well of the legislation.
Will I kick off?
Yeah,
sure. No problem. I think probably two things. The first being a bit of education and awareness. There's a huge amount of confusion around the gender pay gap, and it can cause real disquiet and discontent within your workforce if it's not understood properly. And this is, I suppose, the internal focus, maybe even more so than the external focus. We need to understand the difference between equal pay and gender pay. We need to know that the gender pay gap figure doesn't necessarily mean discrimination or bias is happening. It might, but it doesn't necessarily mean that, and it certainly can't point to that. But what it does tell us is that our representation isn't balanced. And gives us an opportunity to look at that. But that really needs to be understood. We don't need the message to suddenly be, if you've a 20% gender pay gap, that means that, all the female accountants are being paid less, 20% less than all the male accountants. That's not what it's measuring, and that's not what it means. So I think there's an education piece, first of all. I think the second part is getting behind the idea that the figure is the figure, and it could be a terrible first year report, or it could be an okay one, but there'll always be the chances are of it being a great figure first time out are probably limited enough, you know, and there will be definitely room for improvement. But I think that's the important thing, looking at the figure as this is our starting point, or this is where we are now. But the important part is the action plan. What are we going to do about it? What can we change? And the more time we spend in the intervening period now before we actually have to report, actually understanding where our gap comes from. You know, are we not getting enough graduates, let's say, of male and female coming in at the door? Are we losing women when they go off to have children? Is it our culture is actually saying, you know what, this is not a place for women to work, or it's fine till here, but if you actually want to get any work-life balance, you need to ship out because it's not for you? Or is it that we get them to a certain point and they think, you know what, the demands of this organization are just too much, it's not worth it. I can do really well in my career elsewhere without this kind of you know, experience. Or what is it? You know, what are the gaps? Where do we see the kind of the people falling out of our pipeline? And then what can we do about that? What actions can we really take? And you know what, they might not all be this year, they might not all be next year, but if we have a plan, as Sandra says, that tracking of your progress and tracking of your pace and what you're going to do when, you know, people will understand that we don't have necessarily all the answers. And companies that have been investing in, as I say, that, you know, the schools visits, the careers visits, you know, internships, working with the teachers, you know, the teacher training to actually give them experience around stuff, they're still not seeing this complete groundswell difference in their figures. Yeah. But there is progress, and it is moving, but we need to just make sure that we're doing all of the pieces to get more of that movement.
Yeah. Some really interesting questions there to pose to get the conversation going, for sure. And have you anything to add to that, Sandra?
No, I agree with everything that Kara said. Like, and the thing about it is, right, every organization has their own context, their own journey. You know, it's easy, I suppose, to look, you know, take some pointers from other organizations, but really for it to be sustainable and have real impact, you have to bring it into your own context. You know, and if I think about the journey we've been on in higher education, like I remember when I landed in DCU, it was just over 4 years ago now, and I got handed the 64-item action plan with 3 years to deliver on it, and that's part of that Athena Swan, our Athena Swan certification. Now, interestingly, they've linked it, you know, Athena Swan was linked to research funding. So I tell you, if ever there was something to focus the minds of the universities, that was it. But I have to say, we made great headway, not just in DCU, but in the sector, absolutely in DCU, but across the sector, just because we worked with each other. You know, we worked with each other, we shared, we created that, you know, leave the competition outside the door and come in and help each other. And we've done that very successfully. We do a lot of work in the DCU Centre of Excellence and Inclusio in helping organizations with the action planning, you know, so developing your people strategy, building your short, medium, long-term planning. And I think that be realistic in that is, if I was to give one piece of advice, you're not going to be able to do, you know, shift, like this is tough. It's going to be tough to shift it. And just to finish on one thing that Kara had said, do not underestimate the importance of the internal communication, because, you know, you look at your research, Maureen, what did you say? Was it 36% of people said they'd move? Yeah. You know, like that's a risk. So that communications piece before it goes anywhere else needs to be built into your plan. Really, really important that piece is done.
And that came across really clearly as well when I was speaking to our group head of reward as well, that internal communication emphasized that. That's excellent. Thank you both. I don't think we've any more questions, but if you'd like to add in some, please do. I suppose in summary, while it might be a little bit of time off, this is absolutely your opportunity to prepare. Don't underestimate. And again, that's what Rosemary said yesterday, is don't leave it till the deadline. There's real challenges around getting clean data. The internal communication piece is really, really important. Yes, I think initially we might be all, you know, focused on the external piece, but the internal is really, really important for your own internal customers. And I suppose this legislation actually, while, you know, a lot of organizations are stressed at the moment, but if we can take a step back, that it could lead to an opportunity, and we could have stronger organizations and a society if we really do it correctly and in the spirit of what the legislation is about. Now, there is one final question. I think, do some companies need to work and analyse on ensuring they have equal pay in advance of doing gender pay gap figures? Kara.
So equal pay obviously is the lowest possible common denominator. We have legislation for that. We absolutely need to be ensuring that that's the case. I think from our conversations with employers who have started to explore this whole area, they're very comfortable being able to say, we can hand on heart say equal pay is not a problem in our organization. If you're an accountant, you get paid this. It doesn't matter if you're blue, pink, whatever you are, that's what we pay. There can be scales where different people have negotiated different rates, but that's usually associated with experience or whatever. So equal pay absolutely has got to be just the lowest common denominator. But I think, as I say, it has been less of an issue for those organizations that have actually really looked at it, and where they've found anomalies, it tends to be as a result of experience and particular qualifications. Now, there is an argument that you say, okay, are we looking at the right things when we're looking at our job descriptions, when we're looking at the people specifications that we have, and so on? And that is part of this work for sure. But I definitely think the equal pay piece, absolutely, it's there. But I would be fairly comfortable that certainly in our conversations with employers, that doesn't seem to be the challenge. That that piece of work, for the most part, of course there will always be an anomaly and it should be immediately addressed. But for the most part, that doesn't seem to be the big challenge. It is this representation piece being the bigger.
Excellent, very good. Sorry, before I finish, did you have something you wanted to?
Yeah, just one thing on that, Maureen. While I was listening to Kara, I was thinking about some of the conversations I've had with, in particular, senior leadership teams and boards recently around how the redress, right? How do we this representation issue? And one of the biggest challenges I find is, particularly if you have a board that has been in place for 10 years and you're saying, well, this is the way we do things, there's no problem, what's the problem? It can be very difficult. And because then straight away what happens then is the conversation moves to this conversation around, oh, the token, and then the conversation starts to move to quality. Oh, now we have to compromise on quality to bring a woman on frankly, that is BS. Probably not allowed to say that on here, but I don't understand why all of a sudden the conversation moves to quality as soon as we start talking about women, right? So, and I remember reading a tweet one time a couple of years ago. It was a journalist put up on Twitter, and she said, true gender equality will be achieved when women are allowed to be as mediocre as men. Right. So I just thought that was a funny observation, right? But just something that Kara had said there, in the communication with your organization, I think it's really important that everybody in the organization understands what is the gender pay gap, what is it about, how did it come about, and that education then goes out into society and out into homes, because we have to shift away from this. Women are 51% of the population. There are as many ambitious and well qualified and highly intelligent women out there as there are men, right? So there's no gap here, right? This is purely around equity and equitable access to opportunities, and leveling the playing field by supporting both men and women in the choices that they want to make in their lives. And that's what's missing, right? There's systemic things happening in our culture and in our society, and that's the work of the Citizens Assembly, thankfully, that some of them will be addressed. But within, each organization needs to get their house in order. And I would say that part of that is around getting some of these things that are going on in people's heads out on the table around this compromise of quality or lack of qualified women, because that absolutely is not the case.
Hear, hear.
Hear, hear. Very good. Excellent. Thank you both so much. I found that really enjoyable as well as insightful. I think hopefully we've given you a lot to think about. As I said, our piece of advice is start planning now. be in a position to tell your story, be conscious of the internal as well as the external, and there's a potential real opportunity here as well to build a different type of organisation, or to really look at your organisation. Cara, you posed a lot of great questions there. I suppose before I just finish up, there is an opportunity. I know our head of reward, she volunteered if you'd like to have a more detailed conversation, if anybody on this call would like to have a more detailed conversation about her experience in the UK after the last 3 years. She's more than delighted to sit in on a round table. So feel free to reach out to myself or to one of our consultants, and we can get in touch with you about that. And I'm sure Sandra, you wouldn't mind getting involved in that either. And you're always welcome, Cara, if you wish as well. So thank you so much. Really, really enjoyable, really insightful, and we'll leave you to wish everybody a lovely Friday, keep safe, and a lovely weekend. And we look forward to seeing you again at our next webinar. Thank you. Bye bye.
Thanks, Maureen. Thanks, Cara.
Bye now.